The Kennedy family shaped American history, but one daughter was quietly erased and her story was never meant to be told. Rosemary Kennedy said goodbye to the world at age 23, but she didn't die that day. She simply disappeared, before her family's eyes, quietly, permanently, and no one talked about it for 20 years. It was September 13, 1918, when Rosemary Kennedy entered a world that would both embrace and ultimately betray her. The delivery room at Brookline, Massachusetts was filled with Rose Kennedy's screams, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. The family doctor was stuck in traffic, delayed by the chaos of post-war Boston streets filled with celebrating soldiers and honking automobiles. The midwife, nervous and inexperienced, made a decision that would haunt the Kennedy family forever. She told Rose to keep her legs closed, to hold the baby inside, to wait for the doctor to arrive. For 2 agonizing hours, Rosemary's tiny head was trapped in the birth canal, her brain starved of precious oxygen with each passing minute. Rose Kennedy, delirious with pain and exhaustion, begged to push. Her fingernails dug crescents into the leather straps of the delivery table. Sweat poured down her face as she fought against every maternal instinct screaming at her to bring her child into the world. But the midwife held firm, her hands physically restraining the birth. "Wait," she said with the authority of medical knowledge. "Just wait." Those 2 words would echo through decades of Kennedy history like a death sentence pronounced before birth. When the doctor finally arrived, breathless and apologetic, and Rosemary emerged into the world, she was blue and silent, too silent. Her tiny chest barely moved as the doctor worked frantically to stimulate breathing. The oxygen deprivation had already begun its invisible work, damaging the delicate neural pathways that would shape her entire future. But in that moment, as Rosemary finally drew her first breath and let out a weak cry, Rose Kennedy felt only relief. Her daughter was alive. She had no idea what that delayed birth would cost them all. But this wasn't just a difficult birth. This was the moment when the Kennedy family's carefully constructed image of perfection first cracked. Because Rosemary Kennedy was different from the start, and Joe Kennedy saw difference as weakness. And weakness, in the Kennedy world, was unforgivable. But what happened next was hidden for decades. In childhood, Rosemary moved through the grand Kennedy estate in Brookline like a gentle ghost, trailing behind her more accomplished siblings with a sweet smile that masked her struggles. The house itself seemed to echo with the sounds of Kennedy ambition, including Jack practicing speeches in his bedroom, Joe Jr. debating politics with visitors, Kathleen charming everyone with her quick wit and infectious laughter. But Rosemary's presence was quieter, marked by the patient repetition of lessons she couldn't quite grasp and the gentle encouragement of tutors who recognized her limitations. While her brothers Jack and Joe Jr. devoured newspapers at breakfast and debated the merits of Roosevelt's policies, Rosemary struggled to read the comic strips, her finger tracing slowly under each word as she sounded out the syllables. While Kathleen charmed visitors with stories and political insights that made Joe Kennedy beam with pride, Rosemary sat quietly in the corner, working on needlepoint or simple arithmetic, her tongue slightly protruding in concentration. But Rose Kennedy saw something beautiful in her daughter's gentleness that others missed. She wrote in her diary with the flowing script of a well-educated woman. "Rosemary is our angel. She is so pure and innocent that she makes the world more beautiful. When she laughs, it's like hearing church bells on a Sunday morning. There is no guile in her, no calculation, only love." Rose dressed her in the finest clothes from Boston's most exclusive shops, took her to symphony concerts and garden parties, presented her to society as just another accomplished Kennedy daughter. From the outside, the illusion was perfect. In family photographs from the 1920s and early 1930s, Rosemary appears radiant, her dark hair perfectly coiffed, her smile bright and engaging. She learned to dance, including simple waltzes at first, then more complex steps under the patient instruction of a private teacher who came to the house twice a week. She learned to curtsy, to make polite conversation, to present herself as a proper young lady of Boston society. The year was 1938 when Joe Kennedy received the telegram that would change everything. President Roosevelt was appointing him ambassador to Great Britain. For most families, this would be the pinnacle of achievement, the fulfillment of the American dream. For the Kennedys, it became the beginning of Rosemary's destruction. Because in London, away from the protective bubble of Boston society where her limitations could be carefully managed and hidden, Rosemary would finally have a chance to bloom. And that terrified Joe Kennedy more than any political scandal or diplomatic crisis ever could. The crossing to England aboard the SS Washington was a grand affair, with photographers documenting every moment of America's newest diplomatic family. Rosemary stood on the ship's deck in a blue coat that perfectly matched her eyes, waving to the crowd with the same practiced smile she had perfected at countless social gatherings. But behind that smile, she was terrified. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, and she couldn't understand why they were leaving the only home she had ever known. Sacred Heart Convent in London became Rosemary's unexpected sanctuary. The ancient stone building, with its Gothic arches and peaceful gardens, felt like stepping into a fairy tale. The nuns, women of infinite patience who had dedicated their lives to service, saw past Rosemary's limitations to the gentle soul beneath. Sister Catherine, a woman in her 60s who had spent decades working with difficult children, took immediate charge of Rosemary's education. For the first time in her life, Rosemary wasn't judged by Kennedy standards. She wasn't expected to be brilliant or ambitious or politically astute. She wasn't compared to Jack's quick wit or Joe Jr.'s natural leadership or Kathleen's social graces. She was simply allowed to be herself. And herself, it turned out, was wonderful in ways the Kennedy family had never recognized. Under Sister Catherine's patient guidance, Rosemary began to write letters, not elegant prose that would impress literary critics, but heartfelt expressions of her thoughts and feelings. Her handwriting was large and careful, each letter formed with deliberate precision. Dear Mother, one letter began. Today we had tea in the garden. The roses are blooming and they smell like heaven. Sister Catherine says I may help with the younger children tomorrow. I feel useful here. I feel happy. She learned simple arithmetic, enough to handle small purchases at the local shops and count change with pride. Most importantly, she found joy in learning for the first time in her life. There were no frustrated sighs when she needed extra time to understand a concept, no impatient corrections when she made mistakes. The nuns celebrated every small victory, including a properly written sentence, a correctly solved addition problem, a successfully completed task. Her letters home were filled with descriptions of garden parties where she helped serve, tea, afternoon, walks through Hyde Park where she fed the ducks, and quiet moments of contentment in the convent chapel. Rose Kennedy wept when she read them, not from sadness but from a pride tinged with regret. Her daughter was finally happy, finally thriving, finally becoming the person she was meant to be. But it had taken sending her across an ocean to achieve it. But happiness, for a Kennedy woman, was apparently a luxury the family couldn't afford. When World War II erupted in September 1939 and London became a target for German bombers, the Kennedy family faced an impossible choice. They could leave Rosemary in London, where she was thriving under the nuns' care, but where German bombs fell nightly, or bring her back to America, where she would once again become the family's beautiful burden. Joe Kennedy made the decision with the cold calculation that defined his approach to everything. Rosemary would come home. Not because he loved her, though he did in his complicated way, but because leaving a Kennedy daughter in war-torn London would look bad in the American newspapers. Image. Always image. Even when it meant destroying the one chance his daughter had at genuine happiness and independence. This was the moment everything went silent. November 1941. The corridors of George Washington University Hospital echoed with the footsteps of a man carrying his daughter toward a procedure that would change everything. But Rosemary Kennedy walked beside her father willingly, trustingly, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they made their way through the sterile hallways. She believed she was going to see a doctor who would help her feel better, who would calm the rage and confusion that had been building inside her since their return from London. She had no idea she was walking toward her own execution. The journey from the Kennedy home in Bronxville had been quiet, almost peaceful. Joe Kennedy had told Rosemary they were going to see a specialist, someone who could help with her difficulties. He spoke in the gentle paternal tone he reserved for his most delicate negotiations, the voice that had convinced Hollywood moguls to sell their studios and British aristocrats to trust American diplomacy. Rosemary, dressed in her best blue dress with white gloves and a matching hat, looked every inch the proper Kennedy daughter as they walked into the hospital. Dr. Walter Freeman stood in the surgical suite like a confident salesman preparing to demonstrate his latest product. At 46, he was at the peak of his career, a man who genuinely believed he was saving humanity from the scourge of mental illness. Lobotomy, he called it surgical salvation, was his gift to a world struggling with conditions it didn't understand. He had performed the procedure dozens of times, always with the same promise. Unruly patients would emerge calm, compliant, manageable, perfect citizens for a perfect society. What he didn't mention was that they would also emerge as shadows of their former selves, their personalities carved away along with the offending brain tissue. But Dr. Freeman saw this as a reasonable trade-off. Better to be docile and functional than wild and dangerous. Better to be controllable than unpredictable. Joe Kennedy had made his decision with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. Rosemary had become a liability that threatened everything he had built. Her nighttime wandering through the streets of Bronxville had already caused whispers among the neighbors. Her violent outbursts at family gatherings risked exposure in the society pages, and most dangerously, her growing interest in men normal for a 23-year-old woman, but catastrophic for a Kennedy daughter with limited mental capacity, threatened to derail Jack's political future before it had even begun. A scandal involving the Kennedy family's mentally disabled daughter could destroy everything Joe had worked to build. One pregnancy, one inappropriate relationship, one moment of poor judgment could end the Kennedy dynasty before it truly started. The solution, Dr. Freeman assured him, was simple. A small incision, a few precise cuts, and Rosemary would be cured. She would retain her sweet nature but lose her dangerous impulses. She would become the perfect disabled daughter, grateful, dependent, and most importantly, controllable. Rose Kennedy was not consulted about this decision. She was simply told, after the arrangements had been made, that Rosemary was having a small procedure to help with her difficulties. Joe Kennedy had learned long ago that asking for permission was far more dangerous than seeking forgiveness. By the time Rose discovered the truth about what he had authorized, it would be too late to stop what was coming. The surgical suite was cold and sterile, filled with the sharp antiseptic smell that seemed to cling to everything in the hospital. Rosemary was awake. Dr. Freeman insisted on it. His technique required the patient to be conscious so he could monitor their responses and determine when he had cut enough. "It's like tuning a piano," he explained to his assistant with casual confidence, his hands already moving toward the gleaming instruments laid out on the surgical tray. "You know when you've hit the right note?" They strapped Rosemary to the operating table with leather restraints, her eyes wide with confusion, but not yet fear. She trusted these men in white coats the same way she had trusted her father, the same way she had trusted everyone her entire life. The local anesthetic would numb her scalp, but her mind remained frighteningly clear as Dr. Freeman picked up his Lobotomy, essentially an ice pick designed for brain surgery, and began to explain the procedure. Rosemary began to sing as the first incision was made. It was Tea for Two, a popular song she had learned during those happy months in London. Her voice, sweet and clear, filled the surgical suite as Dr. Freeman methodically inserted his instrument through the holes he had drilled in her skull. She sang about having tea and being happy, about simple pleasures and gentle companionship, while the doctor systematically destroyed the parts of her brain that made her human, until the words became meaningless, until the melody disappeared, until the Rosemary Kennedy who had danced in London ballrooms died on that operating table while her body remained alive. When the Kennedy family saw what remained of Rosemary after the surgery, they discovered the true cost of Joe Kennedy's ambition. The young woman who returned from that hospital room wasn't their daughter, their sister, their angel. She was a hollow shell, a breathing reminder of what happens when love is sacrificed for image, and human dignity becomes expendable in the pursuit of power. The change was immediately and horrifyingly apparent. Rosemary, who had once moved through the family home with grace despite her limitations, now could barely walk without assistance. Her legs seemed to have forgotten their purpose, requiring 2 nurses to support her as she shuffled slowly down the hallway toward the sitting room where her family waited. Her face, once animated with expressions of joy, confusion, or frustration, was now a blank mask, her eyes staring without recognition at the people who had once been her whole world. She could no longer speak in complete sentences. The eloquent letters she had written from London, filled with descriptions of garden parties and newfound happiness, were now impossible. She could barely hold a pencil, let alone form coherent thoughts on paper. When she tried to speak, only fragments emerged, single words spoken without context, meaningless syllables that bore no relationship to her thoughts. The complex inner life that had flourished under the nun's care in London had been surgically eliminated. She couldn't feed herself without help, her hands trembling as she tried to guide a spoon to her mouth. The simple arithmetic she had mastered with such pride at Sacred Heart Convent was now beyond her comprehension. Most heartbreaking of all, she couldn't recognize the faces of the people who had once been her protectors, her companions, her family. Jack could sit beside her for hours, telling her about his Navy service or his political aspirations, and she would stare at him with the polite blankness of someone meeting a stranger. The lobotomy had succeeded beyond Dr. Freeman's wildest expectations. It had completely eliminated the problem that was Rosemary Kennedy. Her rage was gone, her unpredictability neutralized, her sexuality safely buried beneath layers of scar tissue and severed neural pathways. But it had also eliminated Rosemary herself, leaving behind only a breathing remnant of the vibrant young woman who had trusted her father to protect her. Rose Kennedy collapsed when she first saw her daughter after the surgery. This woman who had survived 9 childbirths, who had endured countless political campaigns and social obligations with grace and strength, who had presented a perfect facade to the world through decades of Kennedy ambition, crumbled like a paper doll in the rain. She fell to her knees beside Rosemary's wheelchair, grasping her daughter's unresponsive hands while sobs racked her body. She had trusted her husband to make the right decision for their daughter. She had believed his assurances that this procedure would help Rosemary, would give her the peace and stability she needed to live a normal life. Instead, he had authorized her murder, not physical murder, but something far worse. The murder of a soul, the deliberate destruction of everything that made Rosemary who she was. The other Kennedy children were told that Rosemary had taken a turn for the worse, that her condition had deteriorated, that she needed special care that could only be provided in a residential facility. Jack, who had always been protective of his gentle sister, demanded to know where she was being taken when they could visit her. What exactly was wrong? Joe Kennedy's answer was swift and final. She's no longer your concern. We must think of the family now. But this was the moment everything went silent, because the decision had been made not just to change Rosemary, but to erase her entirely. St. Coletta of Jefferson, Wisconsin. The institution sat like a fortress on the prairie, surrounded by endless fields of corn and soybeans that stretched to the horizon in every direction. It was clean, well-staffed, and utterly remote from the world of power and politics that the Kennedy family inhabited. Most importantly, it was far enough from Washington and Boston that no curious reporters or society friends would accidentally encounter the inconvenient truth of what had become of Rosemary Kennedy. The day they took Rosemary away was gray and cold, with the kind of bitter November wind that cuts through even the heaviest coats. She sat in the back seat of the black sedan, staring out the window with empty eyes, no longer capable of understanding what was happening to her or why the familiar sights of home were disappearing behind her. She had no idea she was being erased from her family's history as completely as if she had never existed. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried or how many lies are constructed to contain it. In 1962, 21 years after Rosemary's lobotomy, the Kennedy family's carefully constructed fiction began to crumble under the weight of its own impossibility. But even then, faced with mounting questions about their missing daughter, they couldn't bring themselves to tell the whole truth. The pressure had been building for years. As Jack Kennedy's political career soared from congressman to senator to president, reporters had begun asking uncomfortable questions about the family's third child. Where was she? Why was she never mentioned in campaign materials? Why didn't she appear at family gatherings that were photographed for Life magazine and featured in society pages across the country? The official story that Rosemary was working as a teacher in the Midwest had begun to sound hollow, even to those who wanted to believe it. Rose Kennedy, perhaps driven by guilt, that had festered for 2 decades, or perhaps simply tired of maintaining an elaborate lie that grew more complex with each passing year, finally revealed that Rosemary was mentally retarded and living in an institution. But she said nothing about the lobotomy, nothing about the surgery that had destroyed her daughter's mind, nothing about the calculated decision to sacrifice one child for the political future of another. The official story remained carefully crafted. Rosemary had always been disabled. Her condition was congenital, unavoidable, a tragedy that had befallen the family rather than one they had created. She was presented as an inspiration, a beloved family member whose challenges had taught the Kennedys compassion and motivated their advocacy for the disabled. It was a masterful revision of history that transformed a story of betrayal into one of noble suffering. But the real truth didn't emerge until 1987, 6 years after Joe Kennedy's death, when investigative reporters and biographers began to piece together the fragments of Rosemary's story. Medical records were discovered, interviews were conducted with surviving staff members, and the horrific reality of what had been done to her finally came to light. By then, lobotomies had been universally condemned by the medical community, recognized as the barbaric procedures they always were. Dr. Walter Freeman, once hailed as a pioneer of modern psychiatry, was now viewed as a butcher who had destroyed thousands of lives in the name of science. But for Rosemary, this vindication came far too late. She had spent 46 years in institutions, forgotten by a family that had achieved everything Joe Kennedy had dreamed of and more. Jack had become president, the youngest ever elected, a shining symbol of American possibility. Bobby had become attorney general, then a senator, a champion of civil rights and social justice. Ted had become the family's political patriarch, serving in the Senate for nearly half a century. The Kennedy name was synonymous with American royalty, with public service, with the nobility of politics. And Rosemary sat in a wheelchair in Wisconsin, staring out at cornfields, unable to understand that her sacrifice had purchased her family's success, that her erasure had enabled their glory. The staff at St. Coletta spoke of Rosemary with genuine affection, describing a woman who, despite everything that had been done to her, remained gentle, patient, and kind. Despite the surgery that had stolen her personality and her future, despite being abandoned by the family she had loved and trusted, she never displayed anger or bitterness. She seemed to exist in a peaceful fog, unaware of the world beyond the institution's walls, protected by her damaged mind from understanding the magnitude of what she had lost. She loved music. It was one of the few things that could still reach the destroyed landscape of her mind. When volunteers played piano in the common room, Rosemary would close her eyes and sway slightly, as if some buried part of her remembered dancing in London ballrooms a lifetime ago. The melody of Tea for Two, the song she had sung as her brain was being destroyed, would sometimes bring tears to her unseeing eyes, though she could no longer remember why. She died on January 7, 2005, at the age of 86, in the same institution where she had spent 64 years, nearly 3/4 of her entire life. The obituaries were respectful but brief, mentioning her as the sister of a president, the inspiration for the Special Olympics, the Kennedy daughter who had struggled with mental disabilities. They said nothing about the vibrant young woman who had danced and laughed and written letters from London. They said nothing about the surgery that had stolen her life while leaving her body intact. They said nothing about the family that had chosen political ambition over human love. But her legacy lives in ways Joe Kennedy could never have imagined when he authorized her lobotomy. The Special Olympics, founded by her sister Eunice as an act of penance, now serves millions of athletes with intellectual disabilities around the world. The Kennedy family's advocacy for disability rights, driven largely by Eunice's guilt over Rosemary's fate, helped pass landmark legislation protecting the rights of disabled Americans. Almost no one was allowed to talk about this. But now, finally, 70 years after she was silenced on an operating table, Rosemary Kennedy is being heard.